Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the final talk in the Stained Glass Museum's spring series of talks that we have called The Exceptional Art of Glass. My name is Jasmine Allen and I'm Director and Curator of the Stained Glass Museum, which is located in Ely Cathedral in Cambridgeshire. And our spring series, The Exceptional Art of Glass, has looked at the material of glass in lots of different ways through the industrial heritage of museums. Last week through glass blowing in contemporary glass art. And this evening, we are looking at the place of architectural glass in our built environment. So this series has been organised to coincide with the Glass Heart exhibition at 2 Temple Place, London, for which the Stained Glass Museum has been a lending partner. And I'm delighted to say that our speaker this evening is Andrew Moor, who is a brilliant person to be talking about this topic. Before I introduce him, I will just do some housekeeping if that's okay. Do pop in the chat where you're joining us from, because we love to know where you are, and it's nice for people to see. I think we've got people who've signed up from all over the world, so do pop in the chat where you're joining us from. And throughout the talk, if you have questions for Andrew, at any point you can pop those into the Q&A function, which is next to the chat on the Zoom menu bar, and we will try and answer as many as we can at the end of the talk. So thank you for buying a ticket to this talk and supporting the museum. All the money raised goes directly towards funds to support the Stained Glass Museum, which is the only museum of stained glass in the UK. So Andrew, if you're there, I'll ask you to turn your video on and say good evening. Good evening. You might need to unmute as well.
Sorry.
Good evening. Welcome, Andrew. We're really delighted that you are joining us this evening. And Andrew Moor is really the best person to give us this survey of architectural glass. He is a glass art consultant, a project manager, and a glass designer himself. And tonight he's going to give us an overview of contemporary stained glass, showing how it has evolved over roughly the last 40 years. Andrew has a wealth of experience in this area. Since 1984, he has been involved with commissioning, project managing, and designing works of art in glass. Amongst his major projects, we might cite Hong Kong Airport, the Patrick Heron window at the Tate Gallery St Ives, the Henry Moore window at Much Haddam, alongside various corporate projects and other projects in religious, retail, office, airport, hotel, leisure, restaurant, and private sectors. So he has come across a huge range of artists, styles, techniques, construction and design approaches. And a little plug for Andrew, he has written no less than 3 books on this subject, which together are quite hefty actually. The first of which was published in 1989, Contemporary Stained Glass. The second of which was published in 1997, that's Architectural Glass Art. And then the third one, Colours of Architecture, 2007. And so with all of that in his CV, it won't surprise you that in 2018, Andrew received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Stained Glass Association of the United States of America for his contribution to architectural glass art. So there's many brilliant illustrations in those books, and they are available from all good secondhand bookstores. I believe they're out of print probably in terms of kind of getting a new copy. But Andrew, I'm sure, is going to talk about some of the projects that are represented in those books this evening. And I'm very looking forward to hearing what he says. So Andrew, over to you. Feel free to share your presentation and I'll come back at the end for questions.
Very good. Well, I warn you right away, I do tend to gallop through things. I always say I'm going to cut pictures and not show so many, but I get so excited I want to show them all. So I've been doing this for 40 years, and this is my website, which if you're interested in glass is full of entertaining images. There's a great number of stuff in there. That was part of Hong Kong Airport. And very kindly, Jasmine already mentioned this, but I've written 3 books about it. And just out of interest, the first book sold over 35,000 copies all over the world. And of course, those were the days where if you wanted to know something, sorry, I've got an image on my screen, I'll get rid of it. And this is on automatic timing, how annoying. No, it won't move, right. You really had to buy a book. So that's literally was printed 11 times. This one sold about, the second one sold about 18,000 copies, and the last one sold about 6,000 copies. But we failed to put the word glass in the title, which the publisher was very keen to do. So look, just start. Okay, it's a bit of a ramble. Many of you know this. This is how mouth-blown glass is made. This is the famous Lambert's factory in Valsassen. And this is a guy blowing up a large, what I call a milk bottle, but it will turn into a cylinder. There he's sort of smoothing it out. They're cutting one end off to get to the cylinder. Here he's blowing up the cylinder. You can see one end's just an open cylinder. And this is what they all look like. This is mouth-blown glass. And of course, what you can do is you can start with a clear glass, and then you can, when you've got it a little blown up, you dip it in color, so you have what we call a flash of color around it, which we can remove. This is a guy feeding that glass, which has been cut, the cylinder, into another furnace, and it's on a sort of conveyor belt, and it's going through the other side where it arrives in this chamber, and these two guys unroll it, unfurl it. The whole thing is very sort of Lord of the Rings. You know, there's fire everywhere and flames and burning, and very exciting place to be. This is Lambert's glass in southeast Germany, Valsassen. So this is mouth-blown glass. Why is mouth-blown glass really, really interesting? I try and sell it to for high-end residential because it's expensive, but at the same time, every single piece is a unique piece. So it has this amazing range of textures. You can have bubbles in it. You can have smoky white. You can have any number of colors and these many different textures. And of course, these days we can laminate it, but we'll come to that. So this is a very classic window, which sort of explains, and sometimes when we cut it up, we re-lead it, keeping the flow of some of the patterns. So you can read that. And these are, sorry, just some various sort of, I don't do a great deal of stained glass. I have to be honest in that, but these are some of the projects I've done over the recent years. This is a very painted arts and crafts window. And this is a lovely little church window we did about 4 years ago, working with an artist called Graham Jones that I work with a lot. And again, all the dark blue glass, must remember, was all blue. Before with acid, we etched it away and turned it into sort of tones of blue. Very Chagall-like. And of course, there's a plated, so you've got a blue piece of glass and a red piece of glass at the bottom right, where they've two bits of glass bonded together, or put in the lead together anyway. So you see blue and you see red in the same leaded piece. So a little historical recent rejection. Many of you will be familiar with Matisse's Chapel at Vence. And the next image is the very first design he did for it. I think this is a great encouragement to all of us who are not great artists, that even a great artist can come up with the most appallingly bad design at first thought. Perhaps the nature of a really great artist is that they work very hard, and they probably looked at that for several weeks and then decided this is complete rubbish, hopefully, and he moved on to what we are familiar with. I imagine there were many, many designs in between. I think there are a lot of interesting things about this, which we could all learn from. First of all, the incredibly limited palette. So this is the sort of east window, you might call it. I've got a better picture of that. So here we've got this blue, yellow, and green, very, very limited palette, but this wonderful sort of organic, quite formal shape. Again, you know, a formal shape, repeated. And then you see, this is the point about architectural glass art, is that it works with architecture, and that often means there's an element of repetition about it. It's quite predictable. So when you go into a church and you see lots of, I call them damsels, but they're sometimes men, but in dressing gowns or whatever they are, actually, although they're all individuals, the format's often incredibly repetitive. So you create this framework that works in architecture. You don't have to look at it. It just embraces you with color. And of course, with religious buildings, partly what you're trying to do is to enclose the space to make a sort of meditative environment. So we just brief look at Chagall. Some of us, Patrick Rentian was very fond of saying, and I thought it was very, very true, that we thought the leading was really awful because every single lead line is straight, whereas it would have been very easy to make them all curvaceous like rivers and wandering about, and much more in keeping with the actual images. But this is a sort of probably, you know, the expert criticizing a genius and enjoying doing so. Beautiful project in New York. They are very lovely. Again, very simple, essentially a blue background with sort of spots of color. So there's a reason I'm putting this here. So my first book was done in probably 1989, but I sometimes change it to 1990 for a round number. And it was almost entirely about leaded glass. So it had various pictures of these famous German masters, Ludwig Schafrath, doing this very Germanic, very graphic work. No painting on the glass, no chiaroscuro, no sort of acid etching, just lead work, creating this very, very dynamic forms. And that's another project he did in Japan. Again, you know, lead is essentially the dynamic element. Then, of course, you get Johannes Schreiter, again, really much more subtle and sophisticated in many ways, but still it's lead. It's a graphic image with lead sort of creating these images. You get, really, the glass, these tones in the glass are in the glass when you buy it. It's this, what we call opal glass, and it has a sort of white background, creates this very beautiful effect. Another very classic, and some of these lead lines, of course, are just bonded to the glass. So this is the first big project I was involved with, which you can see was on the cover of my first book, called Buxton Thermal Bars. I worked for famous artist Brian Clark, and of course, this gave me an idea that this is what people did every day in stained glass. They designed 300 square meter barrel vaults. Of course, most people aren't doing that, but I had this rather inflated idea of the scale of things. A very interesting thing, I still think this is one of his greatest works. Very formal idea. It's got a green border all on all four sides. Then it's got this blue coming up, fading away, and then so there's a very real structure to this. That's can't remember the next picture. No, that's something else. Okay, this is a roof light we made for a private client. Again, the same thing. I may say those of you who make glass will look at that cross in the middle and think, maybe, how do you cut that out? How do you cut that and lead that? And of course, there are a lot of these things. When you look at these things, you think, cutting that out. I mean, just northwest of that image, sort of up top left, there's another yellow orange image. So the way these are done, by the way, is they are sandblasted. So I mean, some of it's cut, but essentially you create sandblasted holes. And the great thing about putting a sandblasted hole, it might be a drilled hole, but very often we sandblast it, is that it creates such a soft edge that the glass won't run. Those of you who are wondering how you cut these things. I mean, obviously, when you design a thing like that, you are challenging craftsmen and sort of saying, you know, are you up for making something that's difficult? So my first book was about leaded glass. So my second book, which was nearly a decade later, but the thing had unexpectedly moved on. And what's quite interesting is when I first got into glass, I knew nothing about it, by the way. I mean, I just came off the street and ended up working for Brian in the early 80s. I discovered that architects actually weren't that interested in leaded glass. It was really, you could watch their eyelids sort of drooping as I talked to them about leaded glass and its wonderful thing, nature. Because in a way, contemporary architecture was very much about tall, seamless, weightless glass. So we really thought we need to learn how to make sort of glass 2.5 meters by 1, as you see in this cover. So this project here, which we did in '92, is quite famous. I mean, when I overstate it, but Tate Gallery window at St Ives. And an interesting thing about this is that Patrick Heron was the artist. Patrick Heron was an amazing artist. He was a little bit of an angry man in a way, I think. That was my experience of him, and I had other people confirm that to me. But perhaps because he was an amazingly innovative artist, but never was as recognized as he felt he should be. Anyway, we were going to make this in 25 panels without any lead, and he absolutely insisted it be in a single pane of glass. The window is 5 meters by 5 meters, so I had to get Pilkingtons to tell him nobody made a piece of glass that big. But anyway, so he had it in 2. So this was a very, I've been here a few times, and in a way, Brian was a bit the same. Artists bully you to do things that you don't know how to do. Of course, at that time, I didn't really know how to do anything about glass, but the studio was making it. This was made in Germany. By a big studio called the Derrick's Glass Studios. And you can see here the mouth-blown glass, which we've talked about, which comes about 600 by 900 millimeters, which is 2 foot by 6 foot, or 3 foot by 2 foot, I'm sorry, 3 foot by 2 foot. But normally we cut a little bit off, and then you have to polish the edges. And this is bonded with a liquid silicon to float glass. People had tried this before in the sort of 50s and 60s with araldite, and it never lasted. These have lasted pretty well. And just to give a sense of the scale of this window, it is really quite big. So we were all congratulating ourselves how clever we were for making this thing that hadn't been done before, but we only did it because Patrick Heron bullied us into it. And then, of course, this became quite trendy at the time, and I did a number of things like this, which is we did 5 of these for an office building. And this is just, a single piece of blue flash glass, etched, sandblasted, and with one pale blue cut into 3, very economical, and just bonded to a piece of float glass. And then we did 5 of those on each floor of an office building. And then we did, this is a beautiful window, which we did at those of you who know London, there's the Hermes shop on the bottom of the corner of Bond Street and Booton Street, which it was a very famous building, which John, my brain's gone. Nicholson, the very famous husband of, I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember his name at the moment. Anyway, he had done a lot of work in this building, and Ben Nicholson, I'm sorry. So we had to sort of design this to look a bit like a Ben Nicholson, and these are big panels. I mean, they're panels about 2 meters by 3 meters by 1. Sorry, we skipped that. That's actually a project that's been a long time. It's in a law firm called Linklaters in the city. We did it probably in 95, so it's still there 30 years later, which is very gratifying. An awful lot of things I've done have ended up in the bin, as indeed the one we were just looking at, that went into a skip. I saw it there. I had hoped to rescue it. Again, this is just float glass with colored glass bonded on. And that was a very interesting project we did for SmithKline Beecham with, again, this is the 9 meters by 7 meters, huge, with acid etching, sandblasting, and all sorts of things with these bits of bonded float glass, so mouth-blown glass. And then these are just some other projects. It's a German project where, again, it's just plain ordinary float glass with these really beautiful shimmering colors. And this is a airport project done in Pennsylvania by the artist Martin Donlin, English artist, who does a lot of work in the US. And you can see, again, bonded mouth-blown glass. That's a very big panel. It's about 5 meters tall. And this is the last 2 things. These are just Brian Clark, his screens, which if you, in the UK, they had a fantastic exhibition at the Newport Gallery, Damien Hirst Gallery, just south of the river. And a lot of these screens are there. And if you look at any one of these panels, that's just made often with 2 layers of glass like this. You've got a blue flash glass, because it's been acid etched. Then you've got a yellow glass, which has been acid etched. Then you've had some silver stain added to create the red. And I suspect the green is painted on with a transparent enamel. So you've got 2 bits of etched flash glass bonded together. And you've got to really perfectly match them, of course, because you can see the blue and the yellow butt up seamlessly, but they are two different bits of glass. So my third book, really, again, 10 years later, the industry was moving on. And I was, I like to think, somewhat in the vanguard of moving it on. But by this time, we were doing lots of screen printed glass and things. So this is a building. So that book has a lot of architects working with glass, as well as lots of artists, because I was hoping that architects would buy the book. In fact, the reason I wrote the first book was that I thought that way architects would learn about the wonders of stained glass. The reality is most people in the glass industry bought it, but very few architects did. So I did have one fun meeting once where I went to meet somebody who asked to see me, and he reached back on the bookshelf behind his desk and said, "Look, I don't know whether you've seen this, but I've read this book recently, and I wonder if you could do something like that." So I said, "Well, if you look at the title," anyway, I read it. This is a building called the Kopler Center by Herzog de Meuron, very, very famous Swiss architects who did the bird's eye in Beijing for the Olympics, and in London, the famous Tate Modern, and many, many other buildings. And just interesting thing about this is all just a white frit, we call it these days, but that is a white enamel, just like the enamels that were used thousands of years ago, or certainly hundreds, 1,000 years ago, the black enamel that's been fired into paint forever. So it's a white enamel, and this is a detail. So you can see how you create this really delicate membrane between interior and exterior. And so screen printing glass became very big at that time. This is a project I did for Morgan Stanley. I do like it when people give me challenges. So they had little, I can't remember, maybe they were 80 mil deep recesses, and they wanted backlit glass in them. And this was before LEDs, but there was a state-of-the-art thing, which was you put fluorescent bulbs on the side of plastic. This was very, very new at the time. And so anyway, we created this. We had all sorts of problems, like how on earth we were going to make a map of the world, because they wanted maps of the world, or maybe we'd done a design map of the world, and then we had to fill it up. And eventually, one of my assistants at the time came up with this idea of a wind map. So if you look at the right, you can see these funny sort of parallel lines, but they all come out of a map of winds around the world. This is a beautiful project by this artist, Graham Jones, I work with a lot, done for British Gas. So this is their boardroom. So these are opaque enamels. So with an opaque enamel, if you have red on this side, and then behind it you have blue, you've got to print the red on top of the blue again. So maybe on a separate piece of glass, because they're probably laminated, but sometimes we do print several colors on top of each other, or at least they look as if they're on top of each other when you look at the other side. Again, you see on the left all this acid etching, very characteristic of Graham. Very dynamic. That's what the boardroom looks like. And I'm gratified to say that British Gas, about 5 years ago, moved their office from Reading to Windsor, I think. I'm not quite sure where it went to, I can't remember. And they picked up the glass and took it with them, and we reinstalled it somewhere else. So that was nice. Another Graham Jones project, very classic screen printing of enamel. Now, some of you may sort of be thinking, well, what's this got to do with stained glass? But in a way, it does and it doesn't. It's a very similar discipline, if you're an artist, to think about color and light. But what I said about doing my third book called Colors of Architecture is, and indeed the second book where we were moving to larger panes of glass, is if you see yourself as an architectural artist, then you'll want to work in these various different modes. Whatever the mode is, it doesn't really matter. I think that's a really amazing piece of work. And you can see now this is moving into slump glass. This is still in, I can't remember what year this was, by, probably 15 years ago now. And so these bits of slump glass, this is, by the way, a wonderful office canteen which had an ashtray in it, which even by the time we did this was pretty unusual. But the company was British American Tobacco, and they were resolutely having ashtrays in their staff canteen. In fact, I suspect the staff were expected to smoke religiously. I have no idea. Again, you see this, it's just really wonderful way of putting a bit of geometry into a piece that's quite abstract, sort of expressionistic, and at the same time, this whole new texture. So then very different artist I work with quite a lot who does these very, very simple work. This is a project we did with working with Foster's. You couldn't really get much more architectural than this. It's a balustrade that just moves slowly from green to blue, and then it has sort of lines occasionally in it. Very minimalist. Foster's absolutely loved it. And I was pretty sure they were the only artists she'd really want to work with. And what's interesting about this piece, actually, the first picture might capture, I've got other pictures of it, but the building is made up of a series of sort of domes that are all linked together. But when you see it's the colored band that really expresses the architecture, which is ideally what we should be doing. Just a thing about this is cladding. You know, there is nothing you can't do with glass art in buildings. Now, whether that's stained glass is another matter, but it is architectural glass art. This British Land were our client here, and they actually told me they had never rented a building as fast as they did this. So this is a very important thing to think about, that the commercial benefits of putting art in buildings. So those of us who know London, if you stand up by Selfridges on Oxford Street and look north, you see this 6-meter tall blue wall, and this sort of design takes a lot of confidence. It looks so simple. Oh, it just went from dark blue to pale green. Oh, that's pretty straightforward. And but actually, when you see it, and actually the client said to me about not much more than 6 months after, it said, look, we think the reason it helped us so much selling the building is that it was very sophisticated, it was very contemporary, and it was very calm. And they felt these three things really were what their clients who were going to rent the space wanted their clients to think as they walked in the door. So I think certainly in some cases, these things really help. So just expanding our sort of vision into facade. So this is the first facade I think that we ever did, which is called One Reading Central, which is a town in London, between Oxford and London. And this was the original design. And it's 270 square meters. It's an emergency stairwell, so no one's actually going to see it. And at this point, digital printing of ceramics had just really started. And this is a digital printer. And like all digital printers, on the left, it just runs up and down, back and forth, like your printer in the office. But it's spraying. It's not a 4-color printer. It's a 6-color printer. And it just, a very thin layer of ceramic ink, which then has to be fired very quickly. They say within half an hour, otherwise it'll blow away. Anyway, this was what this looks like. I am a great believer, and I'm trying to evangelize to the architectural and property developing community, probably not very successfully, that there is no better way of sort of branding a building, giving it an identity, making it be a real contribution to the urban landscape than doing something like this. This is what it looks like from the inside. It's not fantastically beautiful because opaque enamels can look a little dead on the interior, but it's really not designed for that because the only people using it are people probably can't bother to use the elevator, so they walk up one floor. But everybody else, unless the fire breaks out, they're using the lifts. And there you can see One Reading Central, and that's sort of what it looks like. I don't know. I know that Yell.com rented the building, but whether that was before or after we did our work, I can't remember. I think it was before. I mean, after. No, before. I think they actually were part of approving the work. So I'm going to just shift into some other types of glass. Dichroic glass is glass that changes color as you move. It's been very big in America with some huge artists like Ray King and Jamie Carpenter and Ed Carpenter and various other people using it extensively. And as you can see, these are all the same color glass, but they move from purple to green to blue to purple, all sorts of things. It's one we did. So the way this works is when you look through it with light behind it, it's one color. And if you put black behind it or the sun's reflecting off it, as happens here, it's moving from red, in this case, eventually, from blue, eventually to red. And in between, it passes through yellow and orange and all sorts of things. So I've done lots of things with this. These were some bar tops that we did, which you can, when the sun hits them, they sort of change color and shimmer and look rather fun. This is a piece of public art, which I'm sorry, I've got some better pictures of that. but I had to go and move all the, in fact, this is taken before we did the doors, so we did the doors eventually. Well, I'm not going to pause about those, actually. They're just very beautiful screens to do with the restoration of the St. Pancras Hotel. But just to say a little bit about restoration. So this is the UK Supreme Court building, where we did some sort of modern work in this rather fake Gothic building from 1900. This is the slump glass, which we'll talk a little bit about. The whole text of the Magna Carta is printed on this, which was quite tricky because the glass, of course, is not flat when we printed it. I made the mistake, by the way, when they told me they wanted the text of Magna Carta. I said, well, what shape is the text in? They all laughed at me because the point about the Magna Carta is there are about 28 copies, but they're all done on animal skin, and some of them are landscape, and some of them are portrait, and some of them are square, so they're all different. There we are. But we'll talk a bit about slump glass in a moment, I think. Anyway, this is other stuff that I did in that building. This is just a fun thing. It doesn't look very big there, but this is the logo, and it's 2 meters by 2 meters. And I've done it in a way where it's just slightly vulgar, in that the colors slightly move and change as you move, but it's just a liquid resin color that's sort of bold. So slump glass is something we'll perhaps all take for granted now, but it didn't exist 20 years ago, in my view. And partly it's to do with the computerization of kilns and all these other things. Now, you know, you can just turn the program in the kiln overnight, come back in the morning and take the glass out. It wasn't like that 25 years ago. You had to sort of, you know, turn it down and do all sorts of things. So what this is, just glass, you make a mold. Mold might have very deep bits, and then the glass doesn't touch the mold, so you get these transparent ribs, and then you just create texture. And there's just a multitude of things you can do with it. Of course, you can color it, like with these screens we did for a hospital. We did about 16 of these. And one of the things I like about them, the thing about glass, float glass, ordinary window glass, it is a very inert and dead material. And however much color you put in it, it still has this sort of reflective, rather machine-made quality. And of course, in a way, artists don't really like perfection like that. They like something to be alive. And so you can create very, very precise things. That was part of the UK Supreme Court. The thing about this is actually made from a CNC cut mold. So in a way, it feels organic. It looks like it's sat in a riverbed and sort of maybe be decayed over sort of 40 years, but actually it's digitally, the mold was made with a CNC cut machine. So the artist obviously gave us a very weird drawing. And I recently put a floor in. I do like it when people ask me to do things that can't be done. These panels are 3.2 by 2.2. Halfway through the project, they suddenly said, oh, actually, can we just support it on 3 sides? I doubt it, I said, but I called my engineer and he said, no problem, no problem. So when you come out of those elevators, which those wooden doors are lifts, you step onto this floor with no support under you at all, practically. And the point about these things was that they have a skylight. It's a very, very, very expensive apartment in London. We just did this about 18 months ago. And when sunlight comes through the glass, which hasn't even been cleaned there because it was still a building site, it creates a really beautiful light on the floor below, what they were after. Slump glass is a tremendous thing to use when you're working in old buildings because it inevitably looks somewhat old. So you've got sort of rough stonework, put a piece of nice slump glass in there, and it'll look like it was probably there for a couple of 100 years or more. I missed part of it. So people sometimes think that they misnomer cast glass and slump glass, but these are cast glass. So this is what we call cullet. Anyway, it's lots of broken up bits of glass heated up to probably 1200 degrees or 1100 degrees. So it really becomes liquid and then it falls into a mold. So this is an artist I work with a bit in London who makes his own work. And you can see they look like La Ligue sort of wall mounts. That's not very big. It's about 2 foot tall. I don't know, 500 maybe 500 by 250 or 200. And this is a much bigger piece of nearly 3 meters tall done the same way. Very, very beautiful stuff. So I'll skip over some of these things. I mean, we do residential stuff, all sorts of different things. But I did want to sort of, what I like to do is to expand people's idea of what can be done. So these are retaining walls. I've only done 2 of these, no, 3. This was a school, a basement, where they wanted to expand the school, so they dug a hole, put some classrooms under the playground. In this case, it was under another building, and they had a light well. So we clad this, and there's tremendous reasons why glass is such a great medium for that, because it will look exactly the same in 50 years, 100 years. If you have a white rendered wall, as I have outside my basement office, which I'm in now, you know, every year you have to paint it, and every 5 years you have to have it re-rendered because it all looks rubbish. This will never change. And this is part of the reason why glass is such a great medium for public art. I don't know where you're from, but in the UK, public art is practically forgotten about. And I have sort of spoken to public art officers in other parts of the country who said, no, I've been assigned to other duties now. We don't do public art anymore. But in America, it is a booming business. And anyway, we go on about that. That's not. This is a very interesting project about placemaking. When people are building buildings and cities these days, there's a lot of talk about creating public space that encourages interaction and calms people's nerves, and generally creates well-being. And this is a place called Bridlington, which is on the North Sea. So on the right-hand picture, you can see the sea. And we created these 8 4-meter by 2-meter screens that come out of the wall. One of the builders sent me this about a week after we'd installed the glass. Just to show, these are very strong. They're actually designed, of course, to withstand pretty high winds, not as high as other projects I've done, but quite high. And you'll see that they have lights on them. Normally we supply the lighting. It doesn't really matter which side the lights are on. This is how they light up at night. It's a little technique that we sort of evolved, and you can see that it looks much nicer at night, of course, because you can't see anything else except the glass. These are really one of my most all-time favorite, that and the blue to green wall, and there's 2 of my favorite projects of all time. Very, very successful, much loved by locals, etc. So I've done a lot of sculptures. These are sort of I call them frozen fountains. They are designed to withstand 200 and 200-mile-an-hour winds. That's just a fake CGI, I should say. I'm hoping someone will put one of those in their garden, or indeed a whole line of those. That's not a very successful CGI. They do look as if they're floating. That's what they look like before we sent them out to Hong Kong to have them installed in a garden. But the base, of course, goes underground, and then they're sort of bolted to a slab. The tallest one was 2.5 meters above ground. And these are some more recent sculptures I did. Again, they have to withstand very, very high wind loading. It's just to give you a sense of the scale of them. They're 3 meters tall. We did a whole series of 10 of these in a garden in Hong Kong. And there's another garden we did think about. So I have to tell you about churches. We'll slip over Hong Kong. I did a very big project in Hong Kong. It was interesting. We did entirely with slump glass. The artist gave us a drawing, and every single panel is different. And that was the 40-meter by 7.61. This is Graham Jones. I mean, it's the nature of art that everybody has different tastes. I absolutely love it. Some people probably won't. I like also the fact they wanted it to have slump glass. We think we won the competition because we were the only people who actually stuck to the brief. And it does, you don't get any reflection off the glass, and it does change it from looking a bit like a sort of ad in a subway to something different. And then this was the one we did in the arrivals section thing. So just a final section, which is, I thought church windows, we should go back to stained glass and talk a bit about it. This is Barack Obama and Michelle Obama in Westminster Abbey with Graham Jones's window in the background with a very unpleasant white window next door to it. There are mixed views about this. I personally think this is a work of real genius, but doesn't mean everybody does. One of the reasons I like it, this window was designed to have these diamond-shaped plaques in it in order that, because it's in Poets' Corner, that you could write the names of various poets. And indeed, if there was any more, you'd have to take out the round ones and do them and paint them and then put them in. But it's interesting because unlike when you're putting a modern thing in a building like Westminster Abbey, the first thing you have to is, how am I going to make it vaguely feel as if it fits in? So he was quite clever. He just stuck to a Gothic border, but when you look at it in detail, you can see it's almost like a Picasso-esque sort of dance. And then, well, again, I mean, I think that anybody who knows how to make glass would see, again, we were talking about these Chagall lines. You see immediately, Graham, this was long before any of us, but he has very few straight lines except where he wants a geometric. The others are all wiggling and curving about. And that's the top of the window. Of course, that's 40 foot in the air, so you probably would never get to see that, but it's done. And there's the horrible white window, which of course means the other window looks very dark, those of us who work in glass. These are some other projects Graham did in Germany, pretty wild. Those of you who know Patrick Rentian, who is dead now, but who was really the father of stained glass, who made all of John Piper's work, and has a very nice piece that John Piper and he made in the exhibition at 2 Temple Place that I mentioned earlier. And these are, and I'll just skip over these, just and a mixture of paintings and glass. I mean, there's nothing like having an entire church to do, one person do the whole thing and do paintings as well, because again, it makes it very integrated. I have a church nearby me, which is a complete potpourri. It must have 8 different styles in it, and it doesn't really help. I just put that in. This is a fun thing where, again, you've got enamel and we're actually bonding leaded glass to that. And that's what that looked like when it was finished. Very odd shaped window to design something for, but it was very successful. Right, I wanted to show you, these are my last 4 pictures. These, if you go to Chartres Cathedral, and many people who are interested in glass do, these are being installed next month. Actually, I think they are installed. They are being opened next month. And they are 4 windows designed by a South Korean artist who lived in Paris since the early 60s. I believe her name, but I often have difficulty remembering it, is Lee Bang, B-A-N-G. But I could be wrong about that because I have difficulty remembering her name exactly. Just to get a sense of the scale of them, they are quite big. She is not a large lady, I would have to say, but they're very beautiful. And what's interesting, I've just got a couple more pictures of these. It's made of 2 layers of glass, and the outside of the window is this piece of glass. So when you look at the window from the outside, you see all this texture, but from the inside, you experience this texture, but it's not the same side you're on. So you get this sort of wonderful effect of this alive, living, breathing thing. So as you go back to here, no, here you can barely see the texture, but you do feel it. You do see it when you're up close. Anyway, I think they're very, very beautiful and something to learn from about how to design architectural glass that really works well. And I think that is the last thing to say. If you're bored and want to know something about glass, there's hundreds of pictures on my website. May or may not be of interest. Very good. Well, I said I would finish at 7:45, so we're not far off. Anybody? It's always difficult to think of questions, and I'm very clear about that.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We have just seen so many varieties of glass and lots of different projects and contexts, and really, really great to hear the range of work that you've worked on and to have an introduction to some of those different effects and techniques. If you've got questions, do pop them in the Q&A or the chat function. If you put them in the Q&A, it'll be easier for us to find them. And while you're thinking of questions, I've got a few, Andrew, so I'm going to kick off and ask you those.
Very good.
You mentioned specifically with the Patrick Heron and a few others, about how the artist can sometimes drive a work in terms of what the artist wants and then how you're going to achieve that. And I just wondered whether you thought that generally architectural glass had been driven by increasing technology and different techniques, or more the artist's vision.
Actually, it's come from both sides, because I have had to drag artists to use new technology, because quite often they are reluctant because they're used to their old methods. And also, there is like we did some windows recently where we had printed film laminated between two layers of glass. Now, there is a sort of slightly ugh feeling about that. Do you sort of feel this is cheapening my art? On the other hand, we used 3 layers of glass and we managed to make it look really beautiful, and we did all sorts of things as well. But I think when you're used to making something as complex as stained glass, to do something very simple as a digital print of any sort feels like you're copying out, you're cheating. So some things I've been led by artists who've wanted to create things. I've had designers who wanted things. They said, can you do this? And I, of course, I love doing things that can't be done. So if someone says, can you do something that can't be done, I get very, very excited about thinking, how am I going to cheat and do it anyway, even though it, quote unquote, can't be done. So it is a mixture of pull and push, really.
Thank you. Someone asks, what does the collaboration process look like between you, artists, craftsmen, and architects, and I guess engineers too, on a single project? Can you say
Okay.
a bit more about
Well,
that?
I do several things. Sometimes I go to a client and say, what sort of design would you like? So I might show them a slideshow of 5 or 6 artists' work. When I started in this business, I imagined I would work with lots of different artists, but in the end, I probably don't work with more than 5 or 6 because I think they are the best at what they do. Graham Jones does something very different from Kate Maestri, who does these sort of blue to green walls and that sort of thing. I mean, they're so different, you couldn't really compare them, and they wouldn't want to do what the other does. And then there are some artists who love doing research into the history of the local town. Well, if I asked Graham to do that, he'd look at me in absolute horror and say, "You must be joking," So yeah, I suppose my relationship is I hire an artist. Sometimes the artist, I just decide, this is what I want to work with, this is what they'll love. I mean, I recently had a project where somebody came to me and said, we want something like your red window in Hong Kong. Well, I mean, obviously I went to Graham because he could do something different, but it'll have many of the same attributes. But other times, so we select the artist, the client and I between us, then the artist is working for me. Then I call up the engineer and say, how thick do I make the glass, and how's it going to stand up? And he tells me, and I just do what he says because that's what I do. One should never be sort of bothered about things like how big the glass is or how thick the glass is. That should be straightforward. As long as you just do what people tell you to do. And then the craftsman, well, factories, have all sorts of tricks up their sleeves. So you go to them and say, I want this. And they say, oh, no, I'll tell you what, we'll do it this way. It'll be better. And you say, oh, well, let's try that. So craftsmen often have a lot to contribute, really, particularly when you're trying to do things that are challenging. I mean, that very last project I showed you with these really beautiful, enormous slumped panels, that's made at the Peters Studio in Paderborn. So they have at least 5 kilns that are 6 meters long. And they know more about how to slump glass into beautiful shapes than you could imagine. And a lot of the interpretation of that was entirely done by them. She did enormous one-to-one paintings. They're literally full size on paper, in some cases more than one layer of paper, but the interpretation is entirely done by them. And that's really a fun thing. I would say when I'm working, I wouldn't, that's a combination of me sort of trying to tell everyone what to do and everyone telling me that I'm wrong and that we should do it the right way.
Someone asks, have you had any disasters, things that haven't worked out?
I must admit, I don't think I've had one for a few years, but there was a time when I remember thinking, why am I working in this stupid medium which breaks? It's difficult. It's a nightmare. Yeah. Do you know, I actually, I'll tell you a secret. My wife accuses me of this as well. I have an amazing capacity to forget bad things. And I think, because I can remember one springs to mind vividly, but there have been, if I dig around, there have been moments where, because I actually work on my own, I've sort of ended up on my own on a ladder trying to do something that I'm very, very ill-equipped to do, feeding a wire through and doing something that I shouldn't be doing because for some reason the installer or the electrician or somebody hadn't done something. Yes, and I thought, why did I have an organization with people working for me and 10 people, etc., etc. So I have ended up in some frightful messes, yes. But as I say, I feel recently, for the last 10 or more years, not so much, because I really have a great installer who doesn't wander off piece and say, well, I've done what you told me, and if it doesn't fit or it doesn't work, it's your problem, which did happen to me in the old days. You know, people say, well, I've done it. You know, that's what you asked me to do. I've done it. And the fact that it isn't finished is your problem. So there we are. The answer is to have a great team of people. And if you're a one-man band like I am, then you have to have develop relationships with people who trust you and you trust them. And I would say one thing, if you are hiring an installer, I use very ordinary installers. They love when I come along because it's always a much more interesting project than what they're doing every day of the week, which is mostly installing sort of shop windows or something fairly dull. And then they put it in their website and it looks very exciting, blah, blah, blah.
Andrew, I wonder, in the age that we're in, with climate change being, you know, a real problem and challenge to us all, what role in these large building projects, kind of sustainability and environmental issues have kind of come to the fore, and where glass fits in with that?
Well, I have put a lot of thought into this, and the answers are not actually as great as I thought they would be when I first started really addressing this. One thing that in hot climates, a glass frit, i.e. white dots, black dots, patterns, images on glass, can reduce two things. Solar gain, not as well as low E glass, but you can use it in combination. So if low E glass is giving you a 0.4 reduction, we can move it up to 0.6, which is substantial. Then solar glare, i.e. all those times when you have to lower a blind, but like I do regularly in my office because I can't see my computer screen, or at least I can't, because the light is so blinding. If that's never happened to you, you don't know what I'm talking about, but believe you me, it can be very annoying. You can reduce solar glare. So, but the truth is, in England, people aren't that worried about solar gain. If they're really honest about it, they probably should be worried more. But in other countries, it would be a major factor. And I did at one point, before 2020, I was in Dubai having a discussion about the airport there, and we were talking about a frit all over the facade of the new airport building, which they cancelled because of COVID. But there are places where it would be very beneficial. The other thing, just as a problem, is that when you laminate glass, and certainly most of the glass I do now is laminated, not all of it, but most of it, it is quite difficult to recycle the glass really effectively because the laminate is a sort of plastic interlayer, and to get that out and to heat it up and melt it and get rid of it is expensive. And as far as I understand it, people are making sort of noises about that, and I keep reading articles about it, but I don't think it's going anywhere.
We were at an event recently where Lambert's representative was there, and he mentioned that they're doing some work on the kind of energy efficiency of the furnaces, because of course making glass is a very energy intensive process.
Yeah.
Do you know anything more about that kind of general moves in the the big glass making industry.
No, I read that on their new website, which there was a footnote because they're just rebuilding the website. And they did say we have made a major investment in reducing our energy output, but I have no idea how they did that. And of course, all of this ceramic is all fired. And of course, slump glass is all fired. And so it is all mainly using electricity. Some kilns are gas kilns, but the bulk of them now are electricity kilns. So yeah, there is a lot of consumption going on. And glass itself, of course, is made at, I can't remember, 1800 C, you know. So it is an energy consuming business.
And finally, Andrew, you've given us a great summary of where glass has kind of evolved in the last 40 years in an architectural context. What do you think are the challenges and opportunities for the next 40 years?
Well, I think we're going through an interesting phase in architecture. And I talked to quite a lot of architects, and people feel that architecture is in a rather plain, sort of dull zone at the moment. You know, minimalist and they, except for Richard Rogers, very few architects have really been keen on color. So that beige is a big thing with them, or they now call it taupe, which sounds better, doesn't it? It's a more subtle color, I would agree. It's not quite the same as beige, but there are a lot of these things. I think these things come in fashions. You know, right now, if you have an antique, don't try and sell it because nobody wants antiques. People are practically burning them. They're worthless, but they will change. You know, 40 years ago, antiques were, they were saleable. Now they're not. These things will change. So we just have to live with the fashion of the times and be very resilient. I'm hoping somebody will one day take over my business and probably turn it into an international, global consultancy. But I think I think that it's like art. You know, this is art. That is the thing. It's about making contribution to the urban landscape. I think you need to have a vision, and I feel I do have a vision, but I feel in a way I've completely failed to achieve what I wanted to achieve, which is that many, many buildings would have, you know, most buildings have stairwells. They have to have stairwells. Most of them have windows. Why don't they have a picture in the whole window? You know, be a 48-story canvas. It'd be great. But I failed to achieve that. So I have a deep, deep sense that I haven't really achieved my objective. But we can only hope.
I think that's a vision that any artist joining us today will also share as well, whether they work in architectural glass or leaded glass. And of course, the role of lead going forward is something that we are all quite interested in terms of making new windows, given the listing of stained glass, traditional stained glass, that's leaded glass, as an endangered craft in the UK anyway. So yeah, really fascinating to hear from you, Angie. Thank you so much for sharing all of those examples with us. And I know many people are joining on the chat to say that this has been a fascinating talk. So thank you. You mentioned the Glass Heart exhibition, which I also mentioned. If you're in the UK and can visit this exhibition in the last few weeks coming up, it's well worth a visit. Lots of glass objects, and many of the techniques that Andrew discussed are on display. There's a screen by Brian Clark, which is made using beautiful mouth-blown glass. So do go and visit that exhibition. And if you want to find out more about stained glass in more traditional settings, such as churches, do consider coming along to an event that we've got in June in London, which is a walking tour with Alexandra Epps, where we're going to get into some of the fascinating spaces in the City of London where there's traditional leaded glass. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, everybody. Thank you again to Andrew. And if you haven't heard of the Stained Glass Museum before, please do look us up and consider becoming a friend of the museum and supporting our work in kind of preserving historic stained glass, but also looking towards the future of this craft and embracing architectural glass art as part of that, because the term stained glass is used in a very broad way, although of course technically there are distinctions to be made between techniques. So thank you again, Andrew, and good night, everybody.